So welcome everybody to the new Tech Talk in the Zielpost building. I think it's the first Tech Talk here, so I hope everything works well. We tested a little bit, so it should be okay. I have a lot of slides, so I'll get started, and I'll probably have to skip some at the end. So this talk is about Vim 25 years old, this day. And you may wonder, like, why this day? Why November the 2nd? Well, the first public release for Vim was in November 2, 1991. And that was on the Fredfish floppy disk. Fredfish is somebody who had an Amiga and wanted to share the software with everybody. So he created these disks where he collected software and sent them out, and by physical mail. And then user groups would copy them around, and they were free, but you have to pay for the floppy disk, basically. But only the one Fredfish disk 591 was published in '92, actually, January '92. So why November 2? Well, that's because if you look at the binary when it was built, and it's like the birth certificate of Vim, and you can see there that's actually November 2. So that's where it comes from. So there have been many Vim releases. This is not a complete list, just the highlights. So yeah, November 2, 1991 was the first one. Actually, I think the second one is wrong. It should be 92. So regularly there have been new releases. But after some time, it slowed down a little bit until Vim 8, which was released a few weeks ago. And in a graph, it looks like this, so you can clearly see that in the beginning there were many releases, and then it started slowing down a bit. It's basically because in the beginning it was easier to add more features because there wasn't much. And the further you get, the more difficult it is to add a feature that's actually adding something. So let's start at the start. Year 0, actually -1 because something happened before it was released. At the time I was working at a company in Holland called OC, making photocopying machines. And to give a bit of context in the world, this was also the same year that Linus announced Linux. I think he didn't really release it, but he announced it, like there was a message on the mailing list that he was working on it. So that's a long time ago. I was living in Venlo, nice house. And so why did I get started with Vim at that time? Well, I was then working at OC for a couple of years, and I saved up some money. I actually had money. I mean, before I was a student, so I couldn't really afford a real computer, so I had to build my own from little pieces that were laying around. But now I actually had money, so I bought a real Amiga computer, which was quite fancy at the time. And it's like a 68,000 microprocessor with 7 megahertz, not gigahertz, megahertz. A whole megabyte of RAM. So people said, oh, you don't have to check for out-of-memory situations, you have a megabyte. I mean, what could go wrong? And a floppy disk with 880 kilobytes. That's actually more than the PC floppy, which only had 720. And 44 megabytes hard disk, which broke after 2 years. And a 14-inch monitor with a whopping 4,000 colors. Except if you switch back to text mode, it's only 16 colors. So this is it. I had it in the cellar. I actually took it out and switched it on, and it booted up. It's still working. Unfortunately, if I try to do anything, it crashes. So, sorry, that's in Dutch. Let's skip that.
Do you remember how much you paid?
I think what I paid for this computer, I think it was something like 2,500, 3,000 guilders. But then I quickly added some cards to be able to add a hard disk. So I think total was like 4,000 guilders. So it would be about 1,800 euros. But in that time, of course, guilders were worth more. So I had this Amiga computer. And at the university, I learned to use VI. And once you learn VI, you know, it's in your fingers, basically. So you want to keep using it because that's the most efficient thing that you want to do. So why is that in your fingers? Well, it's using all the letters on the keyboard for commands, and especially H, J, key, L. That's, you know, what a lot of programs use these days for shortcuts. Where does that come from? I was actually digging through history, reading an interview with Bill Joy, who originally created VI, and like, where did that come from? And it's basically from the terminal that they had. So they had a PDP-11 in the university, and at home they had this terminal with a 300 baud modem. That's 30 characters per second. It's not much. But they had these terminals, and if you look at the keyboard, you can see there's little arrows on the H, J, K, L keys. And I thought, oh well, let's then use those keys to move around. So that's where it comes from. So I didn't start from scratch. I found a program that looked a little bit like VI, or worked like VI, called Stevie. It was originally made for the ST computer, Atari, and was ported to the Amiga. And it was, you know, sort of working, but it missed a lot of commands. It crashed once in a while. Undo didn't work so great. But, you know, it's open source, so you could take it and change it. So that's what I did. So it was written in old Kernighan and Regexp. ANSI C was just out. There were not so many compilers yet. One undo level, just like VI, but it didn't always work. I'll get back to that later. There's time. Commands are missing. There's no temp file or swap file, so if you crash, everything's gone. And the storage and memory was fairly primitive. It's just a linked list. You can see the structure, and it's just the next previous with a pointer to the text and a line number. And actually, you know, if you insert a line, it means you have to update all the line numbers. So this only really works for small files. So what did I do? Well, I did a lot of things that I just wanted myself to be able to write text. And quite soon I found that one level undo is not enough. And I wanted to change the undo anyway, because in Stevie it wasn't working very well. So I made it multi-level undo. Recording, help file, quick fix modes was from the start. Yeah, that's maybe like, why did you add such a fancy feature at the start? Well, it's basically because the compiler I was using, Manx C, was actually generating these errors, and they had their own VI-like editor, which was not very good. But he could do that, jump to the error. So you type make, get some errors, and you immediately jump to where the error is. And that's great. So I wanted that as well. So I just made it. I started adding more and more VI commands, and I was very careful to do it in a way that it's compatible with VI. And there was this set of macros that were able to solve a maze. You should look it up. Actually, the C code for it is also a maze by itself. So that's quite fancy. And that was just fun to be able to, as a challenge, to make that work. And it took a while, but in the end, I was able to run those macros. So it's like, now it's VI compatible. So that was great. So actually, when I was able to run the maze macros, I thought, okay, now I should give it to the world. So next year, I was still working at OC, and since now Vim was published, open source, so other people looked at it and said, oh, let me port it to MS-DOS, and let me port it back to Unix or Sun OS. And that was done by a German, Jürgen Weigert, also working at the university. And there were some other people sending me patches, so it's like, wow, this is actually happening. People like it and use it. That was not so obvious at the time. Of course, there was no real internet yet, so I had to put the source code on the FTP server. Fortunately, my company was willing to let me do that. And there was this newsgroup comp editors that we used. There's no mail list yet, there's no internet yet. It all came later. Year 2, I kept working, making improvements. I made version 1.27, which was like a milestone. It was very well done. Again, posted on CompSource MISC, I think in like 40 parts of SHAR archive, something like that. And again, it was picked up very well. Lots of people liked using it. So I kept going and made version 2. In the meantime, I actually was doing working holidays at the time, and this summer I went to Uganda, which I really liked. And so later in the year, in December, I went again. And while at home, I was working with him. Since I liked the project in Uganda so much, so the next release I made of Vim, I made it what's now called charityware. So I said, well, use Vim as you like, but please consider giving some money to help the children in Uganda. And that sort of worked. In the beginning, mainly the problem was that how do you make international payments? There was no PayPal. So, but I kept adding features, text mode, make error format abbreviations. But everything was still in memory, just a bit more efficient. So I made pointer blocks so that you didn't have to update the line number all the time. Year 3 was a big milestone for my personal life, because then I decided to actually move to Uganda and work there. But before I left, I made version 3.0. That was actually also a big release. What happened at the time was there came a competitor, NVI. Well, actually, the backstory is the original VI was closed source. AT&T had the rights for it, and nobody could publish it and change it. And BSD, Berkeley Software Distribution, was working on an open source version of Unix, the BSD distribution, and they needed a VI. And they said, well, sorry, we don't have it because we can't use the original one. And then Keith Bossis came, and he said, okay, let me do it. And everybody looked at him like, ah, you're crazy. But he actually did a very, very good job of figuring out how VI really worked, and then made NVI completely compatible with that. And he did nearly all the commands. I think he made a few mistakes, but only small ones. But there was one big thing that he added, that was multiple windows. So instead of just editing one file at a time, you could split the window and edit 2 files at a time. Or you could put one in the background and switch between them. And it's like, wow, that's nice. Actually, at the time, I contacted him and said, hey, that's a great thing you're doing here. Can we join forces? Can we do this together? And he was the kind of guy that says, yeah, you can send patches. And it's like, you know, that's not really what I was thinking of. So instead, what happened is I felt, well, let me just take the good things from N, put them in Vim. That was a bit of a scramble to get that done, but it worked. So the next version, version 3, had multiple windows, multiple buffers. And on top of that, a swap file. So it's no longer all in memory. So if Vim crashes or your computer crashes, you can recover your work from the swap file. And that's also a very important thing. Also, it made it possible to edit really big files because it doesn't all have to be in memory. And all the other people also started adding nice features like Robert Webb from Australia. He added command line completion, and he did more nice features like that. But I was moving to Uganda, so I released version 3 in August 12, and a couple of weeks later I was off to work on a project in the south of Uganda. I didn't have a picture of my house, so I used a shot from Google Earth. And this is actually how it is now, more or less. I put the pointer where I lived, so that house, and it's still there. Some other parts have changed, but you can see where the primary school is, the nursery, the new clinic. At the time I was there, the clinic was actually in the big building on the bottom. So it kept growing. It was really great to be there for a year, but you know, I'm a computer programmer and didn't really fit in. So it was good for a year, but then
What did you do there?
I helped with mainly with clean water. The water situation in that area is very bad. So there's a river, but that water is really dirty. There were some boreholes, but the water you get has a lot of iron in it, so you can't drink it. You can't even wash your clothes with it because of the smell and the brown stain. And so I tried to protect pools and create new wells that were working. But it was quite difficult. The main thing that worked was actually rainwater harvesting. And I actually built a huge tank, I think it's like 40,000 liters, next to the primary school to capture rainwater, and so you can use it through the dry season. I think it's actually on the, yeah, it's this one. Okay, let's move on. So while in Uganda, I wanted to keep working on Vim. So I bought a laptop. It was actually quite expensive. And slow and not so well. But it worked, running on battery. There was a generator project, but only ran in the evening. So the main problem was on Sunday that there's a whole day of doing stuff, and I made a cable to go to the car, so I could run my laptop off the car battery until the car battery was empty. So then I had to ask somebody to push the car and get it started. The communication at the time was really difficult. I had to go to the city. At the project, there was nothing. I had to go to the city. There was a phone line with a lot of noise. So the modem would only work like 1200 baud, connect to the university in Kampala, which was a feeder node, which usually worked, but not always. And actually, Robert Webb was doing a lot of work. He was working on the graphical user interface. And he kept sending me patches like, hey, this is nice, and it's split up in like 10 messages and stuff like that. But then some messages went missing, and that was annoying. So we actually started numbering the messages. So, oh, here's message 95. Hey, I didn't get message 94 yet. Can you resend it? And this would only happen like once a week when I would go to the city. So if I miss a message, I would get it next week. So you can see that's pretty slow. But it still worked. So I came back from Uganda after a year and went back to OC to work there. And by the time, the world has changed a little bit. So I could actually get a modem and dial into the internet from home. Wow, that was new, amazing. I also had to buy a new computer. So 16 megabyte RAM, so it's getting bigger hard disk, Sound Blaster cards, you could actually play music with it, quad speed CD-ROM, wow. And I could switch between operating systems, MS-DOS, Windows, FreeBSD. FreeBSD was my main system at the time. And yeah, a 28,000 baud modem, which went over the phone line, so you also had to pay the phone bill. So I made sure I could do everything quickly. In the meantime, the mail lists were created, so it became easier to exchange messages between Vim users. And this was in Berlin. There were a group of people in Berlin that were supporting Vim quite a bit. That's nice. So from here, things basically continued to develop. Working at OC, I made version 4. This is mainly all the things that I was working on while in Uganda came together and finished off. So the graphical user interface were introduced. I think at the moment it was only at Motif in Athena. The help system was completely rewritten into the form that it is now, so you can actually type help and go get the help in a window. C indenting, automatic indenting was added. At the first steps it was really hacky, and over time got a little bit better, but I think it's still quite hacky. Quite a few things were made by Robert Webb, like search and include files, so you can find the definition of a symbol. Completion, auto commands. Auto commands is actually one of the features that's very powerful and very easy to break something. There were a lot of bugs around auto commands that have been fixed, and there's probably a few more. Mouse support, also very interesting. And Vim info, so you could actually store some information, close Vim, come back, and it's still there. So like search patterns, etc. That was added back then. So again, nice release. From here, it's continuing more developments. Here actually the internet started to grow and exist. And so Sven Koekers actually registered Vim.org at the time. He still owns it and made a very informative page there. This is actually the year that Google started, 1998, and which basically means that now the internet starts becoming useful. Yeah, before you know, how do you find anything in the internet?
Alta Vista.
Yeah, Alta Vista. Actually, in Holland there was this guy that made a whole directory of all the websites organized by categories, and yeah. And usually you would actually bookmark everything, like, oh, that's nice, let me bookmark that. Anyway, so in that context, everything was growing in the computer world. So in Vim also, the computer power was more, there was more memory. So there was now finally a chance to add syntax highlighting, because that takes more memory and more computer power to do. And so now we're at version 5. Between 1 and 8, so that's already quite far in the future. Only now you get color. So that took a while to get there. And since things start getting more complicated, I decided I needed an if command. So if something, then do something. And some more. So actually this is where the Vim script started growing. Of course with if you also need an expression. And this really was added like one little step at a time. There was no big plan what Vim script was going to be. It's more like, okay, let's add this, and let's add number, let's add string, let's add the for loop, and one at a time. So you can probably see it's not all that organized. And if you would throw it away and start all over again, you'd probably end up with something better. But we're not going to do that. Okay, Perl and Python got added by somebody else. Also very interesting, Windows graphical user interface was added. Of course, Windows is very graphical, so it's quite important there to have one. You can do things in the console, but it was never very well supported. And there were some more ports, so it started spreading even further. Now, by this time, it's like, okay, I think I have everything I want in my editor. So what shall we add next? So I organized a voting thing on the newsgroup and the mailing lists and said, okay, let's, you tell me what you want. And well, this is the list that came out. And actually, I think most of them got done, either then or a bit later. The top thing was actually folding, which surprised me. People wanted folding, and that means you can collapse ranges of text. And I never asked for it, and I thought, okay, well, if you want it, let's build it. Vertically split windows. Finally, monitors get bigger, so you have the space to do that. Configurable auto indenting. There was only C indenting at the time, and of course you want indenting for other languages. Fixing problems. Actually, this is one that never got added. Perl compatible search expressions. The problem is, how do you do that? If you switch over, like with an option, use Perl patterns, then everything that you already have breaks. And so you would have to put something in the pattern to say use Perl syntax, but then like that's clumsy. So in the end, it never happened. Okay, let's move on. So there was quite plenty of work to be done. And I actually enjoyed working on Vim at the time. And I didn't enjoy my work so much. So I quit my job. And the idea was that I would, do nice things, have fun for half a year, and then find another job. At the time, it was really easy in the computer world to find a job. So I thought, it's not a big risk. And I really enjoyed working on Vim. Quite a bit. So I didn't really start another job in half a year, but did other things. I did a bit of contract work, but most time went into Vim. There was also Linux was growing at the time. 2000 was the time that the internet explosion, or whatever you call it, was happening. So I got invited to Linux World, and there was a lot of companies throwing money on open source stuff and Linux and everything. So it was a fun time. I was actually at the Linux World in a booth of Two Cows, I believe. And they invited me and paid for the trip. And I would go to the booth and actually work on folding. So I was, yeah. And actually, I saw Linus walk by, like, oh, that goes Linus. Okay. Never seen him since. Okay, again, I kept enjoying Vim, so no job. I did become a member of the Dutch Unix user group. It was actually fun to meet people while not at a job. To put it in context, this was Apple introduced the iPod. So, can you even remember that, the first iPod with a little hard disk? I think it had like 10 gigabytes. 5. There was a 10 gigabytes one, 5 and 10. Yeah. Of course, they were really expensive, so they were not sold very much. It only happened much later. And so I worked on Vim again, and version 6 was the next big milestone. And it had a lot of the features that people voted for. So folding, vertical splits, diff mode. This is actually one of my favorites that basically came out of the window split thing. It's like, well, if you have two versions of the same file, why not highlight them in a way that you can see the differences? And combined with folding, because you need the folding to keep things in sync if they scroll. And it turns out that worked really well. There were also a lot of people who started using Vim from scratch. So they needed some help, like how do things work. And at the time, Steve Orlin was writing a book about Vim. And I don't know exactly why, but they made it with a license that allowed people to copy it. That's quite unique for a textbook. And I had an electronic version of it. And I asked them, can I use it? And they said, yeah, okay. So basically the first, I think it was 20 chapters of the book, which was like a step-by-step introduction to how to use Vim. I just copied it, and that's now the user manual. And then I fixed all the problems and the things that I didn't like. And of course, it's a book where you can have pictures, and in text you have to reorganize some stuff. But it was a very good step, and I hope a lot of starting users will find it useful. Unicode support. That's also something that actually came up. Somebody just sent me a message like, hey, why don't you add UTF-8 support? And it's like, what? What's that? And pointed to a web page that explains it. And I quite quickly realized, like, this is actually very useful. Because at the time, Vim was already supporting double byte encodings, like Chinese and Japanese. That's so clumsy. Those encodings are so weird. So if you go halfway a line, you don't know if you're like in the middle of a character or not. So you have to go back to the start of the line and see what it means. And then UTF came, and you can just start anywhere and go back to the first byte of a character. And that's easy. It's good. So that was added. It was a lot of work. A lot of if-defs got added. And also translations got added at the same time. So basically internationalization support. Also plugins. Before that, you could just manually load some scripts or have a mapping that loaded a script. But there was no way to just dump a file in a directory and say, load it on startup. And so that was actually very nice. And file type plugins. So you can set file type, and it would find the plugins needed for that type of file. And color schemes. Some debugging, because Vim script was growing and was getting more and more difficult to find out what you did wrong. And client server, they could run two Vims and they would talk to each other. So again, these are nice features, but you can see it's quite big features. There's a lot of work implementing them. But I didn't have a job, so I could do it. So by this time, Vim was like, one of the best editors in the world, I think. So what do other people think? So this comes from Google Trends. So you can see what people search for. Doesn't mean they actually use it. So can you sort of guess what the blue line and the red line is? Which one is Emacs? Red. You're right. Emacs goes down. And actually Vim also went down a little bit, but it's quite stable over time. And but I really like this picture to see that Emacs is like. did something right. Actually, there's also the yellow line. That's NeoVim. So you can see, well, it just comes out of the noise. So what's the competition? Like I said, Stevie, what I started with, actually it sort of died quite soon after I copied it. Original VI, like I said, was closed source. I could actually look at the source because we had a license. It's terribly ugly. The thing is that it was written in a time that compilers run out of memory. They had like a PDP-11 with I don't know how many kilobytes of memory. And if you would make your file too big, it just couldn't compile it. So they actually had tricks like making variable names 1 character. And like the global variables were like 3 characters. And it's very hard to understand how it all works. It was very clever. The people who made this really knew what they were doing. And it's a bit like a puzzle. But it's not really what you want to use to base a new editor on. Elvis was a bigger competitor. Also made for ST and Amiga at the beginning. Was also developed pretty well. At some point it went in a bit of a strange direction, like adding HTML support, with the idea that you can render HTML in your editor. And I thought, like, it's not going to hold up. I mean, the simple things work, but the complex things won't. At some point, Steve Kuykendall decided he didn't like his source code, so he threw it all away and started all over. And at that point, it's like, well, for 2 years, nothing happened. Until he came in a new release with nicer source code, but it didn't work so well. So at that time, Elvis basically stopped being a competitor. Although some Linux releases at the time used Elvis instead of Vim. NVI, I already mentioned it. It was basically made for BSD to have a VI editor for BSD. And Keith Boschis did a really good job. It was very well VI compatible. I think he was also involved in the POSIX standard at the time. But he just did it, did a few bug fixes, and then stopped. And hoping somebody else would take over, but the problem is who's going to take over a masterpiece? So it basically stopped developing. I'm not mentioning Emacs as a competitor, really. So another thing that happened is that you'll see later then developments on Vim slowed a bit. So some people decided to make a fork to do it in a different way. And they're still doing that. I actually met one of them last month, Justin Kies in Berlin. And I'm not really in contact what they're doing, but you can look at their repository, and they clean up the code and do all kinds of things, and not really many more features. One of the things is that I always hesitate to add new features unless it's clear that it's a good thing. And they basically say, oh, let's just add all the patches that people send in and not have a critical look at them. So they end up with things that are like half finished. And hopefully they will get them full finished at some point, but we'll see. Of course, if they have something nice, I hope I can just take it over back into Vim. Okay, on with my life. Year 11, so we're not even halfway yet. I actually, since I didn't have a real job, I needed some money. So I did some contract work. It was actually a bit as an employee, but it was for a limited time. So Vim was basically spare time work again, so I didn't have that much time for it. This took a bit more than a year. So then it switched again, so back to Vim. But yeah, I was still, not having a full job. And then I liked working on Vim. I wanted to do that, but I needed some money to live from. So what I did was I actually asked people to sponsor me. And in return, you could vote for features. And that worked pretty well. I mean, it gave me enough money to live from. And so I could say, okay, let's build Vim 7 then. So Vim 7 was, again, a big release, and even bigger than the previous ones. I made Vim script much more powerful. since more and more plugins were growing and getting more complicated, so you needed some data structures implemented in C. You could do it in Vim script, but then it's quite slow. So if you implement it in C and leave the hard work to the C code, that works well. So there's lists, dictionaries, functional references, and there's a few more things there. Another big thing that I worked on, which was fun but a lot of work, is spell checking. I wanted to add spell checking since it's a text editor, and I looked around like what exists. There was like aspell as a library written in very complicated C++. There were some other spell libraries. Most of them were just not very good. Like they could find spell errors, but giving suggestions for corrections, they were not so good at. Only aspell could do that. But aspell had some limitations, especially with different languages. So it worked really well in English, but not so well in other languages. And I decided, let's re-implement it. So I did a little bit of research and came up with a solution using a try and putting the whole dictionary in a try. The problem is in some languages that try gets really big, so somebody helped me using compression on the try in memory. So that was quite complicated, but it worked. And I spent a lot of time coming up with an algorithm for giving suggestions. Having a method for scoring suggestions, using sound folding and stuff like that. That was really good. Of course, I didn't write the dictionaries myself, so I used the ones from OpenOffice. I think it's now called Hunspell or something like that. And I worked a little bit with those guys, but they were Hungarians, and I was mostly interested in making it work for Hungarian. And they actually built in Hungarian in the code, while I said, no, you should do it in the definition files anyway. It was a bit of a struggle. It still sort of works. Omni-completion, so more powerful, flexible completion. Tab pages, so you can have multiple pages between those. Undo branches, that's actually an interesting thing. Matching parents, highlighting. I use that all the time myself, especially in JavaScript with curly and other kinds of parentheses. And a grep command, internal grep command, so you can even grep into compressed files. Yeah, another big jump then happened since I was working with Vim 7, and like I say, I was getting sponsored or donations to do my work, but there's a limit to that. And then some guy came and said, hey, why don't you interview for Google? It's like, well, I don't know. So, well, it did happen, and I interviewed, and somehow they said I was okay. So they invited me to come work in Zurich, and okay. That's quite a change, moving to Switzerland, but I decided to do it. But first, I wanted to finish Vim 7. And so when they said, when can you start? I said, well, let's make it July. It's like, what, July? Can't you start earlier? No, I want to finish Vim 7. And that's what I did. I don't think that's okay. So Vim 7 got released. I went on a long holiday, last one I thought before I would go to work again full time. And I did agree with Google that I could work on Vim in my 20% time. So basically 1 day a week I work on Vim. And I think that's justified because a lot of people inside Google use Vim. So I moved to Switzerland. This was my first apartment in Wollishofen. And guess what this is? Somebody recognize it? Yeah, it's a GitHub overview of all the commits. And fortunately, we switched from Google Code to GitHub at some point, but GitHub still manages to see the history of all the commits in the past. And so this is like a very spotty development of, you can see there's some clusters where it's more busy than others. And if I add the years, it doesn't go further back than 2004, but you can see 2004 wasn't so busy. And let's see, 2005. You can actually see, like, at the beginning of 2006 it was quite busy, and somewhere halfway 2010. And so you can guess that that's related to releases. So every time there's a release, there's a scramble to get it out and fix bugs and include patches, etc. 6.4 took a while. 7, of course. 7.1, I don't know. I think that was just like a bug fix release, so there wasn't much work. But gradually, every release became quite a bit of work. 7.3, 7.4. But I think you can see release 8 was an awful lot of work. What basically happened is that over the years, around 7.4, I got a bit bored with including patches, fixing bugs, etc. So I didn't do that much work on Vim. But by the end of 2015, there was quite a big pile of patches that were waiting to be included. So that's why I started to work on Vim 8. Anyway, so meanwhile, we're still for version 7 here. So I moved to Atlasville and got a new computer with 2 gigahertz processor. Wow, that's actually quite a step. So this is my house where I still live now. Very nice house in Atlasville. And well, I keep working on Vim in my spare time. I'm working at Google. Version 7.2 added floating point. It's like floating point in an editor. What do you need it for? I don't know. Somebody sent me a patch, and it was quite a nice patch, and say, okay, let's include it. I actually use it myself when I have to do a quick computation at some things, but otherwise, I don't know. Do some people here actually use the floating point feature? I don't see any hands. Okay. It's there. You can use it. Like I say, at this time, I got a little bit bored. Fixing bugs all the time, little things, little features, all kinds of requests. And I thought, okay, let's do something else. So I started working on Zimbu, which is my own programming language that nobody else uses, so there's just me. But it's a lot of fun to work on it. And I did that for quite a few years, actually, but did do some releases. Actually, this was a nice one, 7.3, added persistent undo. And that's actually very nice. Also, blowfish encryption, so you can encrypt files. Before, there was only zip encryption, which is really weak. Blowfish is supposed to be a quite strong encryption. Unfortunately, the person who implemented it made a mistake, so it wasn't really that strong. Conceal mode got added. That's something that's sort of nice, but it goes to the core of how you display text, so there was a lot of bugs around it. Some interfaces got added. So back to undo. So original VI had just one level of undo. So you could undo and redo, and that's it. And how that worked is that VI had a temp file. So actually a /temp something, there was a file that contained all the text line by line. And what they did was they kept pointers into that file, like which text line is in which part of the file. And then when you change text, you just added a new line. So undo was basically reverting the pointers to point to the old text. So all the old lines were there, and you just have to point to the right one. Only if you go 2 levels, it gets complicated, so they didn't do that. So in Stevie, they actually had it in memory. And basically, if you do like a change command, then the undo is another change command that reverts it. And so they actually had an undo mechanism that is a command to undo it. Unfortunately, that's very difficult to do. So there were a lot of bugs. So when I started implementing undo, I just went back to how VI did it. This is basically saving the line before you change it. So if you make a change, you say, well, this is the text that's going to be changed. So let's save it, and undo is just putting it back. That's not efficient, but it works really well and reliable. So this is the structure I used for the undo from the start. And it's basically a list of blocks with pointers. And the amazing thing is, I did this for version 1.14, very first release, and it's still there. It didn't change. So I actually find it amazing that this structure was so well thought out, or just happened to be right. I don't know. So multi-level undo is nice, but if you go back like 1 or 2 steps and then make a new change, you lose the changes that you made, that you undid. And In some cases, that's pretty bad. Like you can actually lose work. So in Vim7, I added undo branches. So you can actually keep all the states, and you can navigate through it. And the question is, how do you navigate in a tree? So I used time. So you could go back like an hour, or even the previous day. But the previous day meant you had to keep Vim running. The moment you exit, it's gone. It's all in memory. And since memory becomes more and more, there was more and more undo. So people set undo levels to like 10,000. Who cares? And but then it becomes more important that if you exit Vim, you don't lose all of that. So I had actually somebody work on this to make the undo file. So you take the whole undo state, save it in a file. And the moment you edit that file again, you load it, hey, and you can undo again. And it turns out it's worked pretty well, so long as you don't change the file outside of Vim. So long Vim knows about the changes, you can undo it. The moment you have your version control system sync, then Vim doesn't know what to do, so then it doesn't work. But I actually use this a lot. So I have the Vim source code, and I just make changes, and a week later I come back like, what did I change there? And you can actually, go back in time, and that's pretty nice. I've actually found out that a lot of people don't know about this feature, and so I'm advertising it. It's not on by default, so you have to switch it on. Okay. Like I said, a lot of patches went in through these years. I did get a faster computer, actually a 6-core, 3 MHz, 16 GB RAM. The weird thing is, this is in 2011. I'm still using this. It's still working. It's like, it's not really faster if you buy a new computer now, maybe a little bit faster. I did have like the power supply blow up and had to replace that and some other things. And what else? Okay, I put it as SSD in. That actually made a big difference. But you can see over the years that in the beginning, the developments, especially in the CPU speed, went really fast. So like every year you could really buy a faster computer. But these days it's slowed down. So you buy a new computer if one breaks, not if it gets faster. Also 16 gigabytes, it's like, well, I don't really run out of space. So. What did get improved a lot, even the last few years, is the internet speed. So in '95, when I came back from Uganda, it was 28,000 baud. It's doable to see a website if there's no images. Like 2007, it went up to 10 megabits. There, of course, were some steps in between. And now I have a fiber connection, so 1 gigabit. That's really good. Now it's the server that's slow, not my connection. Okay, these are some interesting.
Sorry, what was the last line with Vim? Is the source code size or?
Oh yeah, I forgot about that. Yeah, this is an estimate of the size of the binary. So the first one that I released was 75 kilobytes, and you have a memory of 1 megabyte, so that's great. It grew pretty quick. At some point, MS-DOS, which only can handle like 600 kilobytes, didn't fit Vim anymore. So that stopped working at some point. Again, it's like a curve. Like at the beginning, it grew quite fast, and these days it's like 1-2 megabytes. It's not growing that much now. Version 7.4 added some more things. Was very stable release. Let's skip over this. More patches. Move to GitHub. So actually, Vim was hosted on Google Code for a long time, but it's just stopped, so we had to move to GitHub. I personally don't like Git that much, but basically all the Vim users say, oh, you have to go to GitHub. Okay. There's some nice things like it have continuous integration, so if I commit a patch, then it tells me, oh, you broke something. That's useful. So like I said, the previous year got a bit boring, so I didn't include so many patches. But at some point, it's like, okay, now I have this big pile of patches, so let's make a new release. So basically, I started with making a release thinking like, let me just include all the stuff that I've laying around that people send me, fix bugs. So I started with the Christmas holidays, and this is again the Git commit log where you can see when Vim 8 started, when I started working on it, and I've been quite busy since then. So it started with including patches, but I also thought, like, what new features will people really like? I mean, I can just include patches I have laying around, but I probably add features that nobody uses. So what do people actually want? Well, at the same time, NeoVim was adding some support for running jobs and stuff like that, and some plugin authors told me, like, okay, this is really useful, this is what we need. So I thought, okay, let's see if we can do that. So I looked into adding jobs, channels, asynchronous processing, basically. So you want to run something in the background and get the results, and it should really be asynchronous. So you can keep editing while this happens in the background. The question is, how do you do that? Because Vim is really single-threaded, and nearly all the code depends on that. So making it multi-threaded would be a really big and difficult thing with a lot of bugs. So it's a lot easier if you run something in a different process and then add inter-process communication. And yeah, that should work fine. Basically, you need a way that while the user is typing, he can get interrupted by something that happens in the background, like a message comes in, but not all the time, because then you could, have two things changing at the same time. If you're typing on a line and the message comes in to change the same line, that doesn't work. So basically, what I came up with is that if the user is not typing, or basically Vim is waiting for the user to type, that's the moment you can handle some messages. That works. So I added commands to actually start processes or jobs, and with a lot of options, and things like timeouts and stuff like that are important. This both allows for some simple things, just run something and get the result, but also for some quite complex thing. So this is a simple thing. Basically, run something and display the output in a window. And just look at the log while you're doing something else. For more complicated things, so you can actually have a daemon running and connect to it, you need some way of communications, channels. Again, lots of options, a lot of alternatives. I didn't want to force people to use one way of doing things, so there's a lot of alternatives. And for communication, you need some kind of message passing. And I thought JSON was the best way to do this. It's easy to read, easy to debug. You can read the messages, and nearly all languages just support it. Okay, now I'm going a bit quicker because I want to finish. Testing got improved. Before I was just writing an input file and a check file. Now you can actually have asserts, which works much better. Code style got cleaned up a little bit. The Vim code was still in Kernighan and Ritchie style, which got really old by now. So actually, okay, let's just change it. Somebody actually made a patch and included it. We also removed some code that wasn't working anyway. I mean, Windows 3.1 it probably didn't work. Nobody was using it anyway, so let's get rid of it. Windows XP is actually like the oldest version of Windows I wanted to support. But there was some code that was tricky, so that was only removed after the 8th release. I wanted to add better defaults, especially a lot of people said NeoVim is better because it has better defaults. And that's a bit of a struggle because if I change the defaults in Vim, then users will be upset, like, hey, you changed my defaults that I liked. So I came up with the idea of adding a defaults script that's only loaded if you don't have a vimRC. So for new users, you get the new defaults. For existing users, you keep whatever you have. So it's a bit of a compromise. Packages make it easier to add not just one plugin, but a bunch of plugins that work together. It's not a package manager, just a structure to be able to deal with packages. Timers make it possible to run something asynchronously at a certain time. So I actually made something that shows me the CPU temperature because my CPU fan was failing, so I wanted to keep an eye on it. Partial, so basically more Vim script stuff. Partials, Lambda was actually nice. Closure. So Vim 8 got released with all these new features. It took a long time, from basically January till September. So that's like 9 months. It's almost delivering a baby. And fortunately, it was done very well. Only 2 bugs were found after the release, which were both related to the actual version number changing. Okay, good. So what's next? Well, I don't know, Vim 8.1. I don't really have big plans, but I'm open for suggestions. Okay, that's the end of my slides. Now let's see if we can go to the Dory. That works. Not sure if there's many questions here. Okay, it says failed to load, so that doesn't seem to work. I don't know why. Sorry about this. Ah, okay, now it works. Okay, let me do one from the Dory and then I'll take a live question. We don't have much time, unfortunately. I think Vim can read mail. I mean, the question is basically, does it expand to read mail? Well, Vim already reads mail. What's the problem? But yeah, the general idea is feature creep. Yeah, that's a big problem, especially when there's a lot of users with a very, strong feeling for what they want to do with an editor. They send me patches and I have to look at them like, is this really useful for other people? Does it break? Like, will it generate bug reports? And there's actually one feature with flexible tabs I haven't included because I'm afraid, not that it's not useful if people won't use it, but it probably breaks. There will be a lot of bug reports. And I don't like bug reports, so I don't really want to trigger that. The conceal mode was one thing where I did include it. And it's also a feature that I think not so many people will use. And there's quite a bit of work to make it work. There were quite a few bug reports for it. But yeah, I try to be conservative and not to include too many features. But I do want to include the things that are useful. So that's a tough balance to find. We'll see how it goes. No, that's about all I can say. Is there a live question? Anybody? Don't be afraid.
Are you using like Eclim inside Google Zurich Java code for editing, or?
If I'm using Eclim,
Have you heard of it? Like
yes.
Thingy, or?
Yeah, I don't use Eclipse. I tried, but my setup got corrupted and I stopped again. I think it is true that if you're using an IDE with its own editor and you're used to Vim, that's the tough thing because you like your IDE because it gives all your features, and but it's not a good editor. So Eclim was one attempt to make it work with Eclipse. There's also for NetBeans from Sun. There's been a plugin to use Vim. I think for IntelliJ it doesn't exist. That's all we know. Is there an IntelliJ Vim plugin? No, it doesn't exist. But yeah, so I try to use Vim as much as I can, and it usually works well. But sometimes I see somebody using an IDE, and I think, that actually works better there. So then the choice is to either make Vim work in IDE or make Vim have more features like the IDE, and both are valid. Yeah. Okay. How do I move to the next one? Okay. Yeah, NeoVim. It's a bit of a strange thing because it's a fork. So they took the Vim code and started changing things. But they're basically a very isolated group. They never talk to the Vim users much. They just say, well, we're doing our thing, and they make decisions without asking me, which is fine, of course. Did it influence Vim development? A little bit. I mean, they found some bugs and fixed them, and then gave them back to me and say, hey, NeoVim fixed this bug. It should also be in Vim. Also, some people are like in doubt, shall I use NeoVim, shall I use Vim? And then they tell me, like, why doesn't Vim do this? And so in that way, it does influence what Vim is doing. And of course, the jobs and channels were one thing where plugin authors told me, like, hey, this thing is something that NeoVim is working on, and we should really have it. So that's what happened. I didn't take the NeoVim implementation, by the way, because I didn't like it that much. Okay, any other live question? Yeah.
Are you considering adding a package manager, or like the situation around package managers is kind of weird? I've made multiple ones.
Yes, I looked at it. I looked at package managers, and the problem is, if I ask people around, like, what's the best one? Is there one that really, takes the lead? There isn't one. People say, oh, this one is good for that. This one is like nice and simple, and there's really no winner. And I could make another one. Like, just add to the 3 or 4 that exist, add a 5th one. And is that really better? I don't think so. So that's why I actually added package support in Vim 8. So you can add a package, but actually the updating part, so finding a new update and pressing, update my packages, that part is missing. So I hope somebody will pick it up and make it something that everybody will like. And there's some gotchas, like a lot of these package managers depend on something like Git. So if you have a Windows system, you first have to find a Git version to install. It's not that easy. So it doesn't work everywhere. I mean, ideally, you would just install Vim and it would work, right? But that's difficult, because then you have to do all the updating in Vim script, which is not that easy. Yeah, okay. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay. Let's see if there's one more interesting question here. What should I have done differently? Good question. I don't know, actually. Of course, there's some implementation details that are just ugly and a lot of work to fix. I think I added some features that turn out to be a hassle, like auto-commands, actually. I think auto-commands is the best example. It's something that got added because, like, oh, it's useful and you can do very powerful things with it. The problem is it's not very well defined what happens or at what point it happens. Like, if you're busy loading a file and you fire an auto command like, I'm loading a file, then what are you allowed to do or what are you not allowed to do? Because if you jump to another buffer, then your whole context is gone. If you finish with your auto command, it's like, hey, my buffer is gone. What can I do now? And I think that's one thing that, if I would do it again, I would do it in a very different way. And basically make like 2 layers, like the lower layer that has the primitive functionality and a higher layer where you can do auto commands. It's quite difficult to think how, though. But that's, yeah, auto commands is one thing that I wouldn't say regret doing, but if I would do it again, I would do it differently. Okay, well, let's just keep going a little bit. Any live questions? Yep. Okay.
What do you say to people that Vim is, let's say, hard to use or hard to learn?
What do I think about people that say Vim is hard to use? They're right. Vim is really hard to learn. I remember at university, we were doing assignments, practical work, and basically you would be put in front of a computer and like, here's your task, do this. And you go to the computer, it's like, hey, where's my editor? And they say, no, you have to use VI. It's like, what? How does this work? Okay, here's a copy with the commands. And it's like, isn't there any other editor? No, you have to use this. And that was basically why I learned VI, because there was no way around it. I mean, if you would have the editor that we use in another practical study, and I would never have gotten to it. So yeah, it is hard to learn. But not really difficult. It's a lot of work. You have to learn the commands. It's like, if you're stuck somewhere, you don't know what to do. Well, pressing escape usually works. But the thing is, it's an investment. You invest in learning those commands, and when you know them, It's like, it goes so fast. If people look at you, they say, hey, what did you do there? And how did you do that? I actually had Sven Gukas, who gives trainings in Vim, ask me, can you please make a window that shows all the keys that I typed so that people looking at me what I'm doing can actually see what I did? And I'm thinking about doing that, actually. But yeah, it's difficult to learn, but it's worth it. Okay, one more question, and then I'll stop. Comment on NeoVim. Already said a few things. Yeah, I do think that their website advertises a lot of things that are really advertisements. They promise a lot of things that aren't already true. I mean, they're still at version 0.1. They have, I think, a plan to release 0.2 soon. I'm not sure if the developers will actually manage to keep going, because it would still take a few years before they actually have something that's better than Vim. And I suspect some of them will drop out and say it's just too much work. We'll see what happens. Of course, if they actually come up with some nice things, it's open source, so I can always take it back into Vim, hopefully. I hope so. But actually, in some way, it's actually nice to have a competitor. So, and Emacs has disappeared, so I need something else now. Okay, I think we can stop here. Thank you very much for joining, and I hope you enjoyed it.